Mary Ann Nichols was more than just a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was born Mary Ann Walker on the 26th of August, 1845, in London to Edward and Caroline Walker as the second of three kids. In 1864, at age 18, Mary Ann married a printer's machinist named William Nichols in St. Bride's Parish Church in London. They would stay with her parents until 1880, having 5 children before renting their own home. Shortly after the move, the couple split up. She would say it was due to her husband having an affair, though he said it was due to Mary Ann's drinking and that she had left to work as a prostitute. And she did indeed rack up arrests for this and public drunkenness, though she would also find work through the Lambeth workhouse. During this time, she stayed in cheap boarding houses, as the impoverished people of Victorian England often did. By 1888, she was struggling to survive on the streets of London. Then the fateful day came on August 31st when she crossed paths with one of the most infamous killers of all time. The first victim of Jack the Ripper, Mary Ann Nichols, was last seen alive in the early hours of August 31st, 1888. She was out to earn the money that she needed to rent a bed for the night. Nichols had remarked that getting the 4 pence would be no problem as she had an eye-catching new hat. Around 2:30 a.m., a woman saw her drunk stumbling down Osborne Street, but she refused to call it a night, and at 3:40, her body was found. Police and a surgeon were called to the scene, and she was taken to a nearby mortuary. It was determined that her throat had been slashed twice from left to right down to the bone. There were bruises on either side of her face where she had either been grabbed or struck, and her abdomen had been savaged, resulting in her intestines protruding from her body. In addition to several deep slashes, she had been stabbed repeatedly in both her stomach and genitals. It was estimated that the attack lasted roughly 5 minutes and that the knife was 6 to 8 inches long. But to this day, the culprit has never been identified. Annie Chapman was more than just a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was born Eliza Ann Smith on the 25th of September, 1840 in Paddington as the first of 5 children to George Smith and Ruth Chapman. Annie became dependent on alcohol at a very young age, and who can blame her? The poor lived a rough life in Victorian England. By 1861, she was living separately from her family and working as a domestic servant. In 1863, her father took his own life, and she was driven deeper into alcoholism. In 1869, she married a man named John Chapman. The wedding took place at All Saints Church, and they would have 3 children. One child was born crippled and had to be institutionalized, and another died at 12 from meningitis. These tragedies ended any attempt at sobriety, and in 1884 the couple split up. By 1888, she was staying in boarding houses in Whitechapel, earning money by crocheting and prostitution. Then on September 8th, she crossed paths with one of the most infamous killers of all time. Jack the Ripper's second victim was a 47-year-old woman named Annie Chapman. She had gone out in the early hours of September 8, 1888, desperate to earn enough money to rent a place to sleep. Annie was last seen alive around 5:30 a.m. talking to a man in his 40s with dark hair, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark coat outside 29 Hanbury Street. Around the same time, an occupant of the house heard a woman shout "no," then something hit the fence. At 6 a.m., she was found sprawled on the ground just beyond the back steps. Police and a surgeon named George Phillips were soon on the scene, and they found that Annie's throat had been cut so deeply that the blade had carved into her spine. She was disemboweled with internal organs and skin placed on the ground beside her right shoulder. The doctor speculated that her attacker possibly had some medical knowledge, as her bladder and part of her uterus had been carefully removed and carried away. The handkerchief tied around her throat may have been used to asphyxiate her before the attacker used his knife. This crime has never been solved. Elizabeth Stride was more than just a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was born Elizabeth Gustaf's daughter on November 27, 1843 in a rural Swedish town to Gustaf Eriksson and Beda Karl's daughter as the second of 4 children. At 16, she left the family farm to work as a domestic servant, but slipped into prostitution at a young age with arrests as early as 1865. Around the same time, she gave birth to a stillborn. The following year, she relocated to London, funding the trip with the inheritance she got from her mother, who had passed away in 1864. In 1869, she married a carpenter named John Stride at the St. Giles in the Field Church. The couple had a coffee shop until they split up around 1881. From 1885 until her death, Liz lived with a dock worker named Michael Kidney, but would often leave due to fights between the two. This was the case in September 1888. She was staying in a doss house at 32 Flower and Dean Street. On the 30th of September, she crossed paths with one of the most infamous killers of all time. Catherine Eddowes was more than just a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was born on April 14, 1842 in Wolverhampton to George and Catherine Eddowes as the sixth of 12 children. The family moved to London in 1843, and by the time she was 15, both parents had passed away, leaving her an orphan forced to live in a workhouse. After leaving the workhouse, Catherine stayed with various family members, but none for very long. From 1863 to 1873, she had 3 children with a man named Thomas Lawrence. But Catherine began to drink, which Thomas could not stand, and the pair had violent fights until she left him to be with a man named John Kelly. She paid her rent at the lodging houses by cleaning, sewing, and prostitution. On the night of September 29, 1888, she was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Upon her release in the early hours of the next day, she crossed paths with one of the most infamous killers of all time, who had just slashed the throat of Elizabeth Stride. By September 30th, 1888, Jack the Ripper had already struck twice in Whitechapel, and that night he or she took 2 more lives. The first was a 44-year-old woman named Elizabeth Stride. She was last seen around 12:45 a.m. wrestling with a man in a yard off Burner Street, referred to as Dutfield's Yard. Only minutes later, a man came across her body and quickly raised the alarm. Stride had suffered a single deep wound to the throat 6 inches long. The lack of mutilation suggests that her attacker had been interrupted and left unsatisfied. 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes had just been released from the drunk tank around 1 a.m. She was last seen talking to a man wearing a gray jacket and a gray peaked cap. Then at 1:45 a.m., her body was found in a corner of Mitre Square. Her face and throat had been slashed violently with 2 triangles cut into her cheeks. Like Chapman, her intestines had been cut out and placed by her right shoulder. But even more horrific, her left kidney had been removed and taken from the scene. I think we all know where that kidney ended up. Mary Jane Kelly was more than just a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was born in Limerick, Ireland around 1863, though this is based on what she told Joseph Barnett, a live-in boyfriend, rather than historical records. The family moved to Wales with her and her 8 siblings when she was a little girl. Her landlord would say that she received letters from Ireland lending credibility to some of her story. It is thought she was illiterate because she would ask Barnett to read her the newspaper reports on the Ripper crimes. She had been married in 1879 to a coal miner who died in an explosion a few years later. In 1884, she moved to London and worked at a tobacco shop and as a domestic servant, but she would make more money at a high-end brothel, even traveling to France with a client. In 1887, she met Barnett, and by 1888, the pair were living together at 13 Miller's Court. When Barnett lost his job as a fish porter, she was forced to once again work as a prostitute to pay their rent. She was last seen alive on the 8th of November with a strangely well-dressed man for the area. The next day, the horror of what had happened to her was discovered. The last of Jack the Ripper's canonical 5 victims was a 25-year-old woman named Mary Jane Kelly. She was last seen around 2 a.m. on November 9, 1888, speaking to a man in his mid-30s who was strangely well-dressed for the area and who made an effort to hide his face from the witness. Kelly led him into a rented room at 13 Miller's Court. The neighbors would say they had heard a scream an hour or 2 later, but no one checked on Kelly until almost 11 a.m. She had been mutilated severely, much more so than any of the other victims. Her stomach and right thigh had been completely skinned, and her internal organs removed. Both breasts had been cut off, and her face had been hacked well beyond recognition, with several features partially removed. Her arms had several jagged cuts, and Kelly's throat had been slashed down to the spine. Her heart had been removed, and other organs were in various places around the room, with her uterus and kidney placed under her head like a twisted pillow, and the flesh from her abdomen and thighs piled on a table. It is estimated that the Ripper spent 2 hours performing these horrors. The most infamous criminal case in the world. The year is 1888 and the city of London is about to be plunged into a state of utter terror by a person who would become known as Jack the Ripper. This unidentified monster would take the lives of at least 5 women. The level of brutality was extreme in every case. But who was behind the crimes? One theory points the finger at a painter named Walter Sickert, basing the opinion on the artist's eerie paintings of women from the same area that the monster operated in, some of which resemble the remains of Ripper victims, and many of which show women in vulnerable positions, either unconscious or deceased. In one, he painted the room he himself was staying in and titled it Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. There are also similarities in Sickert's writings to some of the letters attributed to Jack the Ripper, as well as a fascination with the case. But one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence is a mitochondrial DNA match between Sickert and the creature,